Welcome to the podcast, You Don't Have to Listen to Me. Today we are doing a topical episode, not a rant or a conversation. So today we'll be talking about the topic UBI. Some of you may know UBI stands for Universal Basic Income. It is a policy idea famously associated with Andrew Yang, who made it his signature policy when he ran for 2020 presidential primary. So today we'll discuss what UBI is and where this idea came from. We'll talk about the pros and cons of the policy, what kinds of people are for it or against it. So let's get to the bottom of UBI. Let's figure out if this is scary socialism, a blessing in disguise, a pipe dream, or maybe a promising idea for us all.
You may be asking yourself, what is universal basic income? Before addressing the pros and cons and other aspects of this policy idea, let's first talk about what it is and where this idea came from. As defined by Wikipedia, universal basic income, UBI, is a social welfare proposal in which all citizens of a given population regularly receive a minimum income in the form of an unconditional transfer payment. That is, without a means test or need to perform work. In other words, unlike Social Security, unemployment benefits, or disability payments, this would be a program where everyone would receive a guaranteed amount of money, regardless of work history, injury, etc. Other examples would be more akin to a similar concept to UBI called Guaranteed Minimum Income, which would be a program that gives payments to those that do not otherwise have an income.
So there are different kinds or levels of UBI in theory. A full basic income would be enough to fulfill a basic person's needs, or rather, another way to put it, the full amount needed to get any single person to be at or above the poverty line. So if a UBI amount would not be enough to get someone to the poverty line, it would be called partial basic income. As we are recording right now in the year 2025, a full basic income has actually never been implemented, although Mongolia and Iran have had partial UBI programs in the past. You also have the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is a fund for all residents of the U.S. state of Alaska, which averages $1,600. Some describe the Alaska Permanent Fund as the only actual partial basic income that currently exists in practice.
There are several types of welfare systems that exist today that are similar in both concept and practice to UBI. Many countries have programs that give financial aid to children and their guardians when they are below the poverty line. Also, Social Security in the U.S. is a pension program which operates as a UBI for persons of retirement age, with the differences being that the amount is adjusted based on how much you have paid in during your working career. Likewise, a negative income tax would be similar to a basic income for certain income groups. Imagine a guaranteed tax return that would decrease depending on how much you actually made this year. In summary, a universal basic income is a concept aimed at providing financial security to all individuals, regardless of their circumstances, with varying levels of support depending on the program. While no full UBI has been implemented yet, existing partial programs and similar welfare systems demonstrate how the idea could function in practice.
Okay, so now we know a little bit about what a basic income is. So what is the history of this idea and where did it come from? There are examples of unconditional payments to citizens that date back to ancient times. However, the exploration and proposition of ideas that we would recognize as similar to universal basic income really began to develop more after the 16th century. This is likely due to this also being the time period where we start to explore the ideas of modern nation-states and other related politics, and also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Since the Industrial Revolution, there's been more political debate, public awareness on the topic of subjects such as welfare and other types of social programs. But now recently, we're looking at automation and the adoption of AI technologies as another reason that sparked debate on the topic. So how do we deal with income in a society if it isn't actually humans who are doing most of the jobs?
Let's look at some ancient examples of state-sponsored welfare programs. For example, ancient Egypt had state-owned granaries that would dispense grain to the public during times of need. Likewise, the phrase bread and circuses in ancient Rome comes from the fact that the city of Rome dispensed bread or grain to the public for no charge, in addition to the public entertainment in the form of parades and events at the Colosseum. There are also specific examples of monetary payouts. Julius Caesar distributed money to all of the citizens after one of his triumphs, and also left money to all citizens in his will upon his death. It is important to note, however, that the ancient Roman concept of who was or was not a citizen is not exactly universal.
So in the 16th century, we started to see the concept evolve. In Thomas More's book, Utopia, which could be a whole topic of discussion by itself, he imagines a society where each person receives a guaranteed income. More's justification is that, and I quote, "No penalty on earth will stop people from stealing if it's their only way of getting food." Going on, he says, "Instead of inflicting these horrible punishments, it would be far more to the point to provide everyone with some means of livelihood, so that nobody's under the frightful necessity of becoming first a thief and then a corpse." So, in other words, we start to see a concrete reason for this income. In More's opinion, people will be driven to crime if they don't have the resources to live. In a similar vein and time period, we have the Spanish scholar Juan Luis Vives, arguing that the government should be responsible for providing a subsistence to the residents on moral grounds. He saw this as the government's charitable obligation, but at the same time he argued that work requirements should be used to qualify people for poor relief.
More examples of UBI and Social Security proposals occur in the 18th century. Author of the influential Common Sense and the American Crisis, Thomas Paine, the English-born American philosopher, also published an essay called Agrarian Justice, in which he proposed reforms against poverty. His proposals included old age pensions and disability support funded by a 10% inheritance tax based on land ownership. His main view was that men did not make the earth. It is the value of improvements only, not the earth itself, that is the individual property. Every proprietor owes to the community a ground rent for the land which he holds. This was considered one of the earliest proposals for a social security system. He believed that inheritance should be partially a common fund for all citizens. In response to Paine, Thomas Spence, an English radical, proposed instead an unconditional basic income to all community members financed by the socialization of land.
So now then, in the 19th century, American political economist Henry George expanded on Paine's ideas with Georgism. Georgism is the idea that people only hold the economic value that they made themselves. Thus, land and natural resources belong to society as a whole. And then his proposals included pension, disability, and social support that would be provided to citizens as a right.
The early 20th century included many calls for UBI or similar programs in England, especially around the end of the First World War. Bertrand Russell wrote, "A certain small income, sufficient for necessaries, should be secured to all, whether they work or not, and that a larger income, as much larger as must be warranted by the total amount of commodities produced, should be given to those who are willing to engage in some work which the community recognizes as useful." Similarly, Dennis and Mabel Milner of the Labor Party proposed the introduction of an income paid unconditionally on a weekly basis to all citizens of the United Kingdom. They argued the morality of everyone having a right to subsistence.
Then later in England, now in the 1940s, the Beveridge Committee developed proposals for means-tested welfare and child benefits. Members of the committee also developed the first negative income tax model, though it's not clear today if these proposals led to any concrete reforms in England or if they were just proposals.
In the late 20th century, in the United States, Milton Friedman proposed a negative income tax, which would basically guarantee an income for all Americans. Although Presidents Nixon and especially Johnson expressed support for social programs, Congress was only able to pass guaranteed income for elderly and disabled citizens. While Congress passed a negative income tax plan during Nixon's administration, the Senate did not pass it. Later, the Earned Income Tax Credit program won the day. This program results in tax being refunded for lower-income households, which is the program that we are familiar with today. This is not a basic income system by definition because it is totally dependent on having some kind of work, income, and tax paid, which is then later refunded.
And so now that we're living in the 21st century, universal basic income has gained more and more attention. In 2016, the Swiss hosted the first national vote on UBI anywhere in the world. The proposal was rejected, but it's at least evidence of the widespread engagement of the topic with the public at large.
The topic of artificial intelligence and automation, two technologies that have expanded in recent years and are starting to have a major effect on work and employment, has recently spurred more discussion of UBI as a solution to post-industrial economics. Notably, Andrew Yang campaigned for a presidential run in the U.S. with the promise of $1,000 monthly payments of UBI for U.S. citizens, regardless of work status. With studies estimating that soon over 50% of tasks done by humans will be lost to AI, many are searching for a solution that still allows people the ability to have housing and sustenance without necessarily having employment. Some communities have done pilot programs with UBI to study the effects. Notably, Stockton, California, Compton, California, and Tacoma, Washington have done pilot studies.
Another catalyst for the UBI debate was the COVID-19 pandemic. So, due to the notable unemployment worldwide, and many countries having given stimulus checks to their citizens, some proposals similar to UBI made the rounds in common discussion. Nearly 90 nations employed direct stimulus programs, and many created or expanded their unemployment benefit policies. So in this way, people all over the world received a guaranteed income without work requirements. We also saw a large shift in public sentiment from even conservative circles, as those who were affected by the pandemic were largely receptive to receiving stimulus. And politicians from both sides of the political aisle fell over themselves to take public credit for providing stimulus that would, under other circumstances, be debated and argued against, especially by those on the right who would normally be against such welfare programs.
Now that we've learned a little bit more about what UBI is and the history of the universal basic income concept, let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons. Now, we are going to be relying on our own concepts and ideas for these pros and cons. So this will be the pros and cons as we see it, whereas the history section was backed by our research of the history of ideas and the history of things that have led us toward the path to UBI.
So as we're thinking about these pros first, the positives of universal basic income, I do want to put in a caveat that a lot of these thought experiments of how we would implement universal basic income would also come with eliminating the minimum wage. Because essentially, if you have your minimum income covered by your provided government check, you don't need a minimum wage as a wage that essentially pays for your minimum costs because your minimum costs are covered. So, that being said, let's look into some of these positives. Now, one of the strongest pros for universal basic income is just a moral argument. One that we as a society live in abundance, essentially, that we have enough to go around, and that it is therefore morally necessary to ensure that everybody in our society has what they need to survive. You know, essentially, if we are able to feed our people, then we should feed our people. I think that's a pretty clear moral argument that anybody could make. And it comes with all these other benefits as well, such as UBI being able to replace the safety net. So essentially, right now, our safety net is comprised of a patchwork of SNAP, food benefits, possibly rental assistance, healthcare subsidies, all these different pieces of our safety net that are somewhat patchwork and have holes in them. UBI could be that safety net that replaces all of that to ensure that we have our basic standard of living, to ensure that we have our basic survival when things go south. As far as how they would affect the economy, there are mixed reviews as far as how it would affect the price of housing. Some do say that the price of housing could drop, though, such that if you have more flexibility on where you want to live or are able to live, then you have more competition in the rental market. Okay, if you have a progressive taxation alongside this, which could be argued is necessary to make this work, then that takes off some of the pressure of demand on the housing market as well. And overall, being able to have these UBI checks, many types of research agree that UBI could eradicate poverty. We would not have to deal with poverty, living below the poverty line, living below our means, if we are getting that universal check. Another pro to having our UBI would be positive job growth. So this is where eliminating the minimum wage alongside the UBI comes in, because essentially, if I'm McDonald's, instead of having to pay, Seattle's minimum wage of $15 an hour for someone to flip burgers, well, that person has their minimum needs covered. So if I want to hire that person, maybe I only need to pay them $4 an hour, $5 an hour. Now, imagine if you got a $4 an hour raise, you might take that, right? But because I have the autonomy to say that my basic needs are met and I am able to go to a job market and treat it like an actual free market and be selective about what jobs I want to take and demand certain working conditions. Because I have that negotiating power, that leads to finding an actual free market value for that job. Not to mention, McDonald's might be kind of excited about the fact that they only have to pay $4 an hour for their labor force. But having this ability to move around jobs, having the ability to work part-time without it being a life or death issue, with having that ability to be flexible about working in different places at different times, that labor power could be helpful for job growth, could be helpful for stagnating wages. Really feels like a win-win for both sides as far as reducing labor costs, but also giving labor power. And that job flexibility comes with another great benefit, the option to take education as a path. A lot of us now may not feel that we could take education because we need to continue to pay our bills. We need to continue to make that money, get that paycheck, and pay the bills. But if we have our basic needs met, we might be willing to accept that lower standard of living for a while in order to pursue an education to find a better job.
Okay, when we start to talk about the cons to implementing a universal basic income system, there are a few things that come to mind. One issue that is pretty commonly talked about when it comes to any kind of social program is how to pay for it, because there's never going to be an answer to that everybody likes. And one of the reasons for that is that no matter what you do, you're going to have to take the money from somewhere. And one way or another, that comes down to taking money from people that have an abundance of it. So as we saw in the history section, some have proposed an inheritance tax to pay for UBI systems. Others, more progressive tax systems, which would tax rich people more comparatively than people who are lower income. And those things are not very easy to deal with politically, especially in the United States. We're already in a country that taxes the rich less than medium and low wage people are taxed. And so rich people have a huge influence, obviously, and they have a huge say in how their money gets spent. And so one of the big roadblocks to UBI is basically finding a way to redistribute that money, probably from higher income people. Okay, that's all said to approach the first con that I have listed here, which is wealth flight. And that's basically, if you implement some kind of system that's either going to be really progressively taxing rich people, you have the danger that they could just leave. And then you don't have those people and their contribution to society or the economy, and you also don't have their money to pay for your UBI program or your socialized healthcare or what have you. And this may seem as a lower risk in the U.S. because we're, a richer, more developed country, but you can see various examples throughout history and around the world of countries trying to implement social programs or implement some sort of, wealth or land redistribution, and that results in wealthy people escaping, basically, and then you don't have their resources to redistribute. Another con that I have seen listed for UBI is, as Christian mentioned, having this kind of freedom to maybe move from place to place, not be tied to where your job is, not be tied to where your housing is, could result in drastic migration. You could have people moving from cities to rural areas because the rent's cheaper or because they're not tied to being in the city to have a certain job. You could also have a lot of people moving from rural areas into the city because, they're not tied to cheaper housing. And this can have, wider ranging effects on infrastructure, education, ability to find housing and jobs that you have anytime you have a large migration. So that's a factor too. Another issue in general, and circling back to the how to pay for it, could be inflation. It could be that, giving people a certain amount of money every month results in, the whole currency system being diluted, especially if you have a system like we do in the U.S. where they're going to have trouble increasing taxes on rich people to redistribute, and instead they're just going to print money to give people, which is what they did during COVID-19 stimulus and other kinds of stimulus where they've just printed money to affect those monetary payments, and that just results in inflation because that money is not coming from anywhere. We've seen Christian mention, ways in which we could have more competition in the marketplace for housing, for education, or things like the job market. We also could potentially have a situation where we get increased housing costs or increased costs of living, mostly due to predatory means. We could just have a situation, especially, in America, where you have large corporations and conglomerates that can, either affect things in a standalone way or band together. You could have an issue where, hey, we implemented UBI and people are getting $1,000 or $2,000 per month, and your local internet monopoly decides to raise their internet price from $50 a month for everybody living in that area to $100 a month for everybody living in that area. That could be anybody. We could just, make up a name. We could call it Shamcast or something. And you can have a similar thing happen. We've already seen happen, during the pandemic and stuff like that with grocery stores or with housing that's owned by larger corporations. They could just see this as an opportunity to raise prices without consequences because everyone's going to be a little bit more cash flush. So I'm not sure, whether these are dead on cons, as in this is, a reason not to do UBI, but these are things to think about, especially living in the U.S., potential downsides or potential kind of ways this could go wrong. And the main thing is how do you pay for it? And how do you fundamentally change a system where the higher income people are paying a lot less in taxes and convert that to a system where they are paying proportionally more in order to finance a much more robust social program that could, effectively end poverty if implemented in the correct way.
So that's been some good pros and cons. I think this is a good time for us to reflect on everything that we've learned here, think about everything that we've processed, and share with you some of our own opinions and ideas about what we should do going forward from here regarding the question of universal basic income.
There are a lot of philosophies and justifications involved with the question of doing UBI or not doing UBI, as well as why we should or shouldn't go down that path. Some would argue that this is a moral obligation, which I guess depends on your moral and ethical views, right? An ethical, humanitarian question. Some would use these kind of arguments as a reason why we should or shouldn't proceed with UBI or other social programs, right? You have those in the United States, you would put them on the left or call them Democrats that basically would say that, all people deserve this or deserve that. And so that's why some of these programs that are already in place are called entitlements in the U.S., because there's definitely a proportion of people that believe that they are entitled to them or that everyone is entitled to them. On the right, you can see people argue that instead of, giving people free things, quote unquote, handouts, you should be encouraging people to work or encouraging people to contribute or to kind of better society as a whole. So the question is kind of, should we just give people everything? Some would frame that as, do we give people everything for free or do we have them work for it? And which of these two things is going to help society better? I think there is a question of ethics, and I think there's another question of practicality. How do we pay for this? Could it possibly be paid for? Are people going to get around the system? Are they going to be able to kind of scam this and get things for free or game it so that they, get more than they deserve? On the other end, especially if this is something that's based on a progressive tax system, is this something where people are just going to be able to find loopholes and not pay their taxes and therefore not contribute to the UBI? There definitely has to be a way to guarantee that, it's going to function. And that's hard to see at this point, especially when we've had trouble reforming our existing social programs, and we've also had trouble implementing any kind of fixes for our education or our healthcare system. Those seem, at least to me, like they're smaller issues or a smaller things to implement than a universal basic income. So if we can't handle those kind of like smaller building blocks, it seems maybe a little bit unrealistic to be able to tackle something as big as universal basic income. That being said, on the other end, Christian and I have been talking a lot about, as he mentioned, a universal basic income and no minimum wage solving a lot of the current issues that we see. If you have enough every month to have a house and something to eat, and everything you work after that is extra, then you can still go out and work a little, work a lot. You could choose to be an engineer or a doctor. You could choose also to, start your career at baking or doing something creative, or try different jobs, or try to figure out what's going to work for you, because you're not under the pressure of, hey, if I'm not at my job every single day, or if I don't get this certain job, I'm not going to be able to pay my rent, or, I better not mention these OSHA violations because I really can't, miss my next paycheck. The freedom to be outside of that cycle could be really helpful and could be a boom to an economy that's already kind of struggling as we're kind of developed past industrial, post-industrial in this country, where we don't have a lot of people in factory jobs. We don't have a lot of people doing blue-collar work. It's kind of like minimum wage or seven figures. So there has to be some kind of way to diversify the economy, and this could be a way to do it. So I think that if we could implement a UBI with no minimum wage, I think that would be the way to go. I think that would be a great path forward. My idea is just that it's not realistic. If we could find some way to fix our broken healthcare system in this country, or even just somewhat fix our broken tax system in this country, I would have some sort of confidence that we could approach this subject realistically. But until we take some smaller steps, I don't think that we can realistically tackle a larger project like this. The other thing that I kind of like to bring up as maybe food for thought is, what is the role of the state or the government in our society, right? Is it, I guess we have some sort of pre-existing conception of, the state providing roads and education and other things, but at least in the U.S., we don't associate the government with providing health care. We do associate the government with Social Security, but not with other things. So I guess, one of those things that will probably be brought up somewhere along the way as we inevitably move towards the path of developing more social programs to kind of deal with the post-industrial world is, is this the job of the state? Is this, what do we expect our government to provide, and how do we expect the government to pay for that and compensate for it? Because we're just kind of in a period here where our tax code and system is not really designed for a social welfare state. It was designed for more free enterprise and independence in mind. And our Constitution and I think our founding philosophies are kind of conflicting between these moral questions and the organization of the government and the responsibilities of the government to do those things. And we've already had breaks from that through, surveillance programs, through national policing, through our military. I mean, we've already broken away from founding principles. So, are we at a point where we just need to kind of fundamentally rewrite the whole system and say, hey, the taxes are going to work like this from now on. The government's going to do this, this, and this from now on, and kind of do, how would I put it, a more modern system, like the examples that we always see mentioned in Europe or other places. There's definitely enough wealth and enough economy here, if you just go by the numbers, to fund a lot. And militarily, we fund more than anyone in the world. So there's definitely kind of a way to pay for everything, but I don't think we can. I think we're approaching the limit of what we can do without a restructure. And so think about UBI as a concept and how that would work for you and your community, but also think about how would it work within the structure and the system that we have, and how could we or should we restructure the entire system to kind of approach these issues.
So I want to talk about a couple points here. And of course, you don't have to listen to me, but one of the debates we have today is around welfare programs, many of which do come with means testing, about the concept of means testing versus a universal approach. Obviously, it's been a very hot topic with our healthcare, especially as we debate between a universal healthcare or means-tested Medicare. But a core argument as to why universal healthcare or universal basic income or any other universal social program becomes superior to means testing can be that means testing is very hard to do, very expensive, very impractical. These are resources that are ultimately wasted to check to see if you are worthy of receiving the resources to help you live. As long as that money needs to be means tested, you will have a failure on both sides. On one side, you'll have people who actually need that service, people who actually depend on that healthcare or that income, who ultimately will fall through the cracks and not receive that benefit because of one or another institutional barrier. While on the other side, you'll find people who don't need that service, essentially scamming it, as would be said, essentially finding a way to get that service, that welfare program, that entitlement, without actually qualifying or having needed it. You're going to have these people fall through the cracks on each side. So instead of putting so much work and resources into ensuring a means-tested program is rolled out correctly, and the alternative is to provide that universal outcome. It's very easy, cut and dry, just cut a check to everybody. And in my mind, the way that you rectify that, instead of trying to means test it on the front end, is you remedy that through progressive taxation on the back end. We already have the IRS and an entire tax system put in place to ensure that, the amount of money that you're paying on taxes versus your income is correct. I think that if you couple that sort of entitlement as a universal outcome with your tax return, it's probably a lot more airtight or sound way to deliver those benefits to people. I ultimately would recommend UBI for America because I do believe we have enough resources collectively to get it done. As Jesse has kind of mentioned, the numbers are there. There is a study that looks at how the relationship between GDP per capita interacts with quality of life. Okay. Now, obviously, early increases in that GDP do have great improvements for your country. If you think about a third world or developing country, increasing that GDP per capita has great improvements for quality of life. But as we look around in our modern times at some of these very developed countries with robust economies, plenty of resources, lots of food, nothing to worry about, that relationship between quality of life and increase in GDP diminishes pretty significantly. The results of this study suggest to me that after a certain point, we should not prioritize growing GDP over growing our quality of life. And in my mind, UBI serves as that switch. Once we reach that point where we have plenty of resources to cover everyone's minimum needs, when we get to the point where we look around and we're like, why is everything so unaffordable if we're the richest country in the world? Right? Why can we not afford our food and our rents and our health cares? But we have so much money. Our stock market is booming, the economy is booming, but we are not seeing those gains among the people. That increase in GDP is showing minimal improvements to our quality of life. And I think that UBI gives us that switch to say, hey, let's cut that check, provide for everybody's basic needs, and build an economy that prioritizes well-being overall. Now, part of this, I do believe that the majority of people, maybe not everybody, but the majority of people who, if they are not working, they will find something to do. A lot of, maybe in the older generation, I can't necessarily speak for the younger folks, but, even retirees go back to work because it just gives them something to do. Now, whether or not they go to work or go and spend the money that they have, I do think that we don't need to have an economy where everybody needs to work. Especially in the way that our economy is going with artificial intelligence and automation, a lot more things that are in regards to necessities and a basic quality of life. We may see declines in needs of labor for that. And so UBI gives us that opportunity to say, not everybody needs to work, but you have the choice to work, and you can go and do something that you want to do. Or we could really benefit from having people who are not working in jobs instead pursuing small business ideas, entrepreneurship, even following creative ventures, creating art, movies, film. I personally look at the movies in the theater and I see very commercialized art. I would love to see art that was created not because they needed to be paid, but because they wanted to make something out of it. So these are just kind of some of the little benefits that I think of when I think about, in general, making sure that your people have their basic needs met without being tied to some minimum wage job that may not even pay enough anyway. If we do take the bold step to say we have the resources we need to get it done and provide for everybody's basic needs, I do believe that we all collectively live better lives.
We hope that you enjoyed this spotlight on universal basic income. Our sincere desire is that whether you were already aware of this concept or not, you have at least learned a little more about the subject. Let us know if there are any questions you have, or if you have ideas for more topics we should cover for the show. Thank you for listening and supporting the show. Feel free to discuss these topics with family and friends. Thank you for your support. You don't have to listen to me, but please subscribe and share if you want to hear more. We have many more topics to unpack, and we hope you'll join us for the next one.